Good morning, everybody. How's everybody feeling? Good? Yeah. Super excitable. Yeah. That's fine. That's cool.
Coming out to the first slot of the morning, 10 a.m. Early for some.
I'm just going to fix this little... Whatever I did not take.
Wow, it's just like a stream.
Right?
Hey, hopefully you're here for podcasting. Because if you're not, sorry.
You're here now.
Yeah, you're here now. So you have an opportunity to learn some very cool things about podcasting.
You've been warned.
Yeah, you've been warned.
I'm pretty sure they closed the doors, so.
Yeah, I don't think there's any escaping.
Yeah.
So hopefully you want to do a podcast by the time you leave.
Yeah, we're trapped in here with
Oh,
them.
sorry. We should introduce ourselves before we get started.
Okay.
Yep. I'm Nick, and this is my good friend Nick, and this is also my friend Nick.
Mm-hmm. That's our gimmick.
Yeah, that's
I'll
our
name
gimmick.
Nick.
Actually,
It's legit.
Yeah, it's legit.
that's amazing.
And we do a podcast called Fantasylogical, where every week we explore the weird and wonderful world of fandoms. We originally started as the Nick's Cast, but that was too self-indulgent, so we tried something different.
Was your theme song Nick, 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 Nick?
No, it was
We
not.
might have been more successful than Next Caster. That had been our theme song, but
Yeah.
unfortunately, no.
There you go.
Worried about-
But we've been doing a podcast for the past 4 years? 4 years? I don't remember. It's been a while.
Thank you.
And so we've learned a bunch of things about doing a podcast, how to get that started. And so today we're mostly going to be talking, if you don't have any kind of prior experience doing recording or anything like that. So for example, if you are an individual podcaster, we can help you out today, hopefully. If you're podcasting with a friend or multiple friends in the same space, we'll probably have some advice for you today. If you are podcasting with somebody who's not in the same space, like you're interviewing someone over the internet, we can probably help you today. If you want to do on-the-street interviews, if you want to be some sort of journalist out in the field in a war zone, if you have a crew of people, like a film crew, you probably know more than we do, so...
Yeah, this is very, very chill, very low stakes. Just sitting down behind a microphone, much like this,
Yeah.
and podcasting.
Yeah, and if anybody has any questions, just put up your hand and we'll do our best to address it as we go through. If you have an anecdote or a comment, please save it till the end because we want to try to keep things moving along, and helping people out is probably better than being like, oh, I have this cool story about podcasts. It's like, we have lots of cool stories about podcasts.
We should have time at the end, so if you
yeah,
guys,
we should,
we'll just throw it out.
When we started these slides, we decided to take a cookbook approach. So today, your recipe for podcasting is, you 4 important steps before you start, the ingredients to a podcast, the instructions, and then, clean up, because the important part of any recipe is making sure you clean up your mess, and you will make many messes.
Clean up as you're cooking, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah, mise en place is very important. So before you start, this is a very important part of doing a podcast, is knowing the answers to these 5 questions. They don't have to be perfect answers, but you should have some thoughts on them.
Yeah. So number 1 with a bullet, why are you podcasting? Do you have opinions about Doctor Who that everyone else must hear?
Do you have opinions about Infinity War that people haven't heard at this point?
Do you have opinions? Do you have opinions about Twin Peaks that nobody's heard about at this point?
Yeah, but also questions like, are you doing this because you want to meet other people? Are you doing this because you have opinions? Are you doing this because
You like hanging out with your friends and you kind of want to broadcast that that feeling.
yeah, or because you want to be internet famous? Like however, whatever that why is for you, you should know it, because it's going to change how you go through the podcast in later parts, and it's going to change what motivates you as you continue doing your podcast.
Doesn't knowing it is more important than what it is. As long as it keeps you producing, then that's good.
Yeah, for us, a big component is why are we doing this? It's well, it's fun and we like hanging out together. And it so happens that there are other benefits to that, but that is the part that keeps us going, and that's important to come back to.
All right. So then you got what? So we want to talk about format.
I think that's more the how, but doesn't matter. Just
Yeah. Okay. So what? So now that you've figured out why you're podcasting, you figure out what your podcasts are going to be, which may follow on very neatly from your why. But you can do an interview show where you get people in a particular industry and talk to them to find out more and educate your audience. You can do a solo show where you just rant, or just improv for an hour. People do that.
Or scripts.
Or you have it scripted. Some people do that as well.
Yeah, you get a very fast, like punchy kind of show when you do a scripted show, or you get like 8 people together in a room and try to edit the crosstalk out after.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. So yeah, you touched a little bit about format.
Yeah.
Because we'll talk about this more as we go through this panel, but people are going to come back to your podcast expecting kind of the same sort of thing every time. So it's okay if you do a guest-driven podcast and every episode is a different guest, but if one episode you're doing a discussion and the next episode it's scripted and then another episode you don't have a guest, it's hard for people to follow along. So just kind of like when you set out, kind of think about the format you want to do and try to follow that. It's okay to change things over time.
Yeah, it's all like figuring out what works and what doesn't, and everything you think of at the beginning is not necessarily going to work right away, and you're not slave to like, well, we did this when we started, so we can't change anything. Like we've completely messed around with the format as we've gone. We're almost 100 episodes in, and I don't think the early episodes resemble the ones we're doing now at all. But what was that? Yeah, don't be afraid of changing things up if something's not working.
Yeah. Think about who you're doing the podcast with. Is it yourself? Is it multiple people? Is it people on the internet? Are they like super famous guests? Because that's going to change how you reach out to people. That's going to change how you do the actual work of the podcast. Again, you don't have to know everything right up front, but thinking about that. And know when you're going to do this podcast. Can you actually do once a week? Or is once every 2 weeks more doable? Once a month? Can you do a daily podcast? You might have big dreams and ambitions to have a really amazing podcast, and then reality sets in, and you might not be able to do that. So think about something that you can do that's maintainable.
As an add-on to that, if when you begin you think you can do a daily podcast, and I'm sure at some point you will be dissuaded of that notion, don't release them daily, but record every day. Then you'll have a bunch banked, and then you can release them over a period of months.
So that's stuff before you start. But what do you actually need to do a podcast? Well, in this room, I think we have collectively all of the different pieces that you would need to start a podcast. You need hosts. There are 3 of us, so 3 hosts. We got that covered.
Make sure they all have the same name.
That's an optional component of it. Headphones. Why would we say that you need headphones? If you're recording a podcast, oftentimes, depending on what you're using to record, there can be other noise that gets into the audio recording. We do our podcast, I would say remotely. Nick Z and I live in the same house, but we are in different rooms. Nick G is in a different city. And so sometimes when you're doing that, you need to hear the other person, and if the sound is coming out of your speaker and then it's being recorded by your microphone, then it's a real pain in editing. And we've actually had some guests come on the show who also were remote, and anytime that you can hear yourself in the recording, it's really hard to edit out unless you're an expert. Yes?
Would you still need headphones if everybody's in the same room? Would
If
you
I-
still recommend it?
If everybody's in the same room, it's probably fine, because you're not going to be broadcasting any of the sound over any speakers or anything like that. But if you do have multiple speakers in the same room, and if you're able to do so, it's nice if you can give everybody their own microphone. But we will
But
come
if
to
not,
that.
but if you're all just huddled around one microphone, then it doesn't really matter about it bleeding through to other people's tracks. It's all going to be like
Yeah, with one microphone, you're going to wind up with one track. So all the talk over whatever background noise is just going to be on that one track. So headphones would be optional.
I would say if you're in that situation, make sure you work out a series of hand signals so no one is talking over each other, because that will be a pain to edit, or if not editing, a pain to listen to.
You need a microphone. In our case, we have way too many. 5, 6, I don't know. Too many microphones. But you need at least one. We'll talk about microphones in a second. You need some sort of editing tool. Yeah, that can be Audacity, which is a free tool. It can be Audition,
Me GarageBand.
GarageBand, like lots of things. If you have somebody who's doing your podcast with you who's just volunteered to edit, thank them. Give them gifts, because editing is probably the hardest part of the podcast.
So he's going to talk about that in a bit.
Yeah.
Yep.
You need a place to host the podcast. We're going to come to a slide in that in a second. If you're doing a video podcast, which we are not going to talk about a lot today, like more just touch on, then you obviously need like a webcam or like a handy cam or a digital camera or something like that. We're not going to focus on that, but if you want to do that, there are people who do video podcasts.
It's not a creep. It's not like a creep of people being like video podcasts are more popular or anything. Just some people add a video component and some don't. I feel like it's very hit or miss.
Microphones. So, if you're starting a podcast, you can do this in lots of different ways. Most laptops have a webcam built into them. So if you're looking for a super ultra budget, I just want to get started option, you could use that. You can also use, if you already have a headset, the microphone that comes built in with that. You can use your cell phone to get started, just to like have something to use for your podcast.
We have had people on recording with Rock Band mics, which they work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
If you're just scrappy DIYing it, if that's what you got around, just grab it and start.
Yeah. That being said, if you have like a little bit of money, and it's not much, I think like the Blue Yeti, which is the blue microphone.
It's like $50-$60 or something.
Oh, sorry, the blue Snowball, which is the blue microphone.
Yeah.
Or the Yeti, which is the one on the far right. The Snowball, the round one, is like $50 or $60.
Yeah.
And it sounds pretty good. And more importantly, it has a bunch of different settings. So if you're recording with a group, you can set it and it'll kind of capture around the entire mic.
Actually, if anyone wants to see.
There you go.
Hey, isn't that convenient?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's,
Oh wow.
Oh, it's not good.
I would consider that like a podcast mic. Like that's why it was made. I'm pretty sure. Like it just fits the purpose really well.
Yeah.
Because you can get a whole table if you stick it in the middle. Same with the Yeti.
Yeah, the Yeti I think is like $100 or $120, so it's more
it's come down.
expensive.
Quick thing I'll note with the Snowball though, there are newer models that don't have the switch in the back.
Oh, yeah.
So it doesn't have the settings, so check if you're going to buy the Snowball.
Yeah, there's a blue Snowball, and then there's a blue Ice, and then there's a bunch of little variants. Like you have one that the stand doesn't get removed.
Yeah. The stand is just. Yeah. It's just attached.
Yeah. So lots of options if you want to just get started with anything. Honestly, I would not recommend using the webcam if you could avoid it. If you have a headset, that'll give you much clearer audio. And since you're doing a podcast, presumably that's entirely audio, it's kind of important that it sounds good. Oh, yeah. Okay.
But if that's what you got and you need to just like get reps in of just doing a podcast, especially if you're doing it like by yourself, you need to learn how to talk to yourself.
Yeah.
Then just record and record and record, and the quality will go up as you go. But don't emphasize like try not to let anything be a barrier to starting, because it's very easy to start with pretty much any computer you can get these days.
Yeah. Hosting. We're not going to talk a lot about hosting because honestly, the number of hosts continues to grow and grow and grow and grow. That being said, we've got a couple listed up here. They all have different advantages and disadvantages. There are hosts that you can use for free, like say SoundCloud or YouTube. I believe Podiant provides like a free plan. I'm not 100% sure. You should
Podbean has a free version as well.
Okay.
We've been on half of these.
Wait. Yeah, we have. So just when you're looking to start your podcast, kind of take a quick look at them and see what's important to you. For example, Buzzsprout is really good at different social features. Podiant's whole deal is like, hey, we want to do the whole practice of planning your episodes to release. So they've got a bunch of tools for that. Podbean, I don't know what its claim to fame is.
It was there.
It was there.
It had us for a while, but
Libsyn is like the established podcasting host. Like
I don't think they have a free plan.
No,
I believe that they're the oldest. I believe that they're the oldest. That's pretty much their claim to fame.
yeah.
But if you're looking for like a dirt cheap, as in totally free, incredibly basic hosting service, it doesn't have stats, but you can use archive.org.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you do that, you probably won't have a website, which may or may not be a problem for you. And a lot of these will provide like a really basic website on top of that. So it's like, here's your episode, there's a web player, you can embed your episode in Twitter, Facebook, etc., all that kind of stuff. Yes?
Is there a podcast host that you prefer?
We started on SoundCloud, I'm pointing at the screen. I'll point at the
Yeah.
screen. We started on SoundCloud, and it was kind of quirky. They'd kind of added on features for podcasters, but it wasn't great. They also had stats, but the stats were like super weird. Because one week it's like, oh my god, we have 1,000 downloads.
That happened in like a day.
Yeah, that happened like in a day, and they would all come from the same location, so we couldn't really rely on the stats. But it does have like this nice network that you can connect to other people. We then moved to Podbean, which was fine, except for us it had this weird quirk where some of the times you'd visit our website and you could see the header, but none of the episodes would load. And then we moved to Podbean because it was this really cool site that this developer who also happened to podcast started to create, and it had this whole dream of you can do things from start to finish. So you could like list notes for your topics before you've started the episodes. You can like send a link to guests. It's like, here are the nights that we're recording, which night would you want to do? And so it provided a bunch of options for us. So like we eventually went to Podium, but like depending on your requirements starting a podcast, like honestly anything that makes it easy to get you into the process of doing things works.
Yeah. How long have we been on Podium?
A month?
A month? And Podium got us on Spotify. One of the podcast white whales.
Oh yeah, that's some of these make it really easy to try to post your podcast on Spotify. They won't guarantee that it'll get you onto Spotify, but they already have a relationship with them. So it does make that transition easier. Some of them don't. I believe Podbean, Podient, I don't know if SoundCloud does. Buzzsprout probably doesn't. Libsyn
Like
definitely
SoundCloud
does.
and YouTube are not like set up for podcasts. They're places you can put them.
Yeah.
But the rest usually have some sort of way to transmit your podcast to like iTunes and Stitcher and like all those other different platforms.
Okay, podcasting. This is all that there is to podcasting. Plan an episode, record an episode, add an episode, and release it. That's it. Thanks for coming, everybody. That is
Hope this
all
was
it is.
illuminating. Thank you.
Yeah. But there is a little bit more to it than that.
A scooch. All right. Know what you're going to talk about. And if that means that you're interviewing a guest who knows a lot of things and that you know nothing, that's what you need to know, right? It doesn't mean you have to be an expert on everything you're talking about. Some people know more than others, and we haven't had people with the knives out being like, "Hey, you were wrong about this thing that you said," yet.
Give it time.
Yeah, exactly. But just like know what the episode you're about to record is going to be about.
Yeah, the guests are a particular case where if you are going to have a guest, you can prepare questions if you're not an expert. If you are an expert, you can think of things that are like unique to the thing that you're talking about, so you can get really deep into your topic. If you're doing a discussion-based podcast, knowing your topic could mean like having questions prepared for your co-host. If you're doing a scripted podcast, like have those notes. But that dovetails nicely into have an outline, know the kinds of things that you're going to talk about in the episode, and write them down. Because at least if you're having a discussion with your friends, if that's the kind of podcast that you're doing, you can always be like, oh, right, we need to come back to the point, which is this is the next thing that we're going to. If you have a guest, you also have the benefit of you can potentially send them out the outline so that they know what to expect when they come onto the show. And that makes the show come a lot more smoothly.
It eliminates those like everyone just like hits a downbeat and there's just silence. And you're like, But if you have an outline, you can just move to the next thing. Like you'd be hearing a lot more if we didn't have this, for example.
Line everything up. If you have guests, know what time zone they're in, and make sure that you've got your calendar set up correctly so that you are interviewing them at the right time.
We've just time zones have been something that we've more recently paid attention to after having not paid attention to them.
9 times out of 10, we have had no problems.
That's right.
And then 1 time out of 10, I forget that Mountain Time is a time zone.
We have guests on
That's a myth.
from we have a guest on from Australia
Oh, that's
next week.
Okay, yeah.
So we're gonna be putting on a podcast for that.
Even if you're not interviewing guests, like know your own schedule so that you can make sure, oh, well, I work until 6 and then the podcast is at 7 and I need to eat in between and also maybe shower and, just make sure that everything is set up in a way so that you're not entering the podcast very stressed and you're just able to like get into it in a relaxed way.
Yeah, make it. Regularity is a key part of podcasting, and being able to make a regular spot in your own schedule is just as important.
Recording. The second hardest thing? I don't know. I'm just going to keep making Recording is an important part of the podcast because that is how people are going to hear what you're actually recording. These are just some quick tips. There's probably many others that we have forgotten, but they're really easy to remember when you're recording. Try to maintain a consistent distance between your mouth and the microphone. A good measure is about 6 inches, or like the distance of a fist. That means you're not getting too loud on the microphone and having the noise, what is it called, clip
Yeah.
in your audio track. And it also means that whoever's editing it doesn't have to constantly be like, oh, okay, he was really loud, and then he was really quiet because he took the microphone away, and then he was really loud again, and it just makes everything that much more smooth.
Dynamics processing to the rescue.
Yes.
That helps a little bit if you like talk like this and talk like this, but it's still really hard if you're like, whoa, and then you come back into the microphone.
If you're gonna cough, for example, maybe move away from the mic. If you're gonna sneeze, maybe move away from the mic.
Yeah,
If you're gonna yell, move away from the mic.
yeah, if you know that you like bang on the table or anything. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bang.
Who bangs on the table?
Yes. You ever get a lot of breaths in the mic?
Sometimes.
Not so much.
Yes.
You want to talk about this?
Yes. Yes, we do. After you've been recording, it's hard to put a concrete number to it, but like after so many episodes, you kind of get used to having that distance, and the breaths become less of a problem. But speaking as the editor, the problem that you run into when you have guests on who might not be podcast hosts themselves, or might not be like public speakers at all, or anything like that, is that pretty much every different guest you have has a bunch of quirks that maybe you had at the beginning, but you've kind of gotten past or broken out of. Yeah. So if you're having a lot of guests on, you might have that breathiness. I'll talk a little bit more about it later on, but what I find helps is the remove noise or reduce noise.
I was gonna say noise gate.
That would, yeah, if
Possibly. I'm using Audacity, so it's pretty basic.
If you're using something like Audition, you can use dynamics processing, and you can say, hey, any sound below this decibel level, just kind of quiet it. You can either do that with like a hard, after this amount, just like don't hear it at all, or you can have it use a spline, and then it'll smooth it so it just gets softer. I do the editing for our mini-sodes, which happen occasionally.
Yep.
And that's been really great to make editing fast.
I use Streamlabs OBS. It's all done while I'm recording.
What? Okay, I'm gonna check that out.
Right?
Anything else for practices?
I'm just going to pass it back.
I really like that I went ahead and said yeah when I don't edit it at all. But yeah, you're going to learn that everyone has their own particular quirk when recording audio, and when it's someone you do the podcast with every week, you learn them, and you can be like, hey, maybe don't squeak your chair,
Make that little click.
It took me a lot of podcasting to realize that I go when I'm about to speak.
I think it's actually a pretty common quirk, but you don't really. It's one of those things you don't notice until you're listening back to yourself, which is another thing. If you're editing, get used to the sound of your own voice recorded. It's kind of weird at first.
Just like power through, like
Yeah.
because you're like, oh, is that me? Is that me? But like, you're not going to be able to get this podcast going unless you can, not enjoy, but tolerate the sound of your own voice recorded.
If you're in a room that has a lot of hard surfaces, this is a bad example of something that I say that you should do and do not do in my own recording. For example, if you have like a lot of hardwood floors and just like flat surfaces that don't have any texture, you're in a room that has a lot of books or things like that. When you're recording, the sound kind of like bounces around everywhere, and it makes its way back to the microphone, and it ends up as this sound that's really hard to remove from the track afterwards. Fortunately, depending on your setup, there are ways that you can mitigate that. If you're recording in a small space, you can like drape a blanket or a towel or something behind you to prevent the sound from bouncing behind you. There are things you can buy, but you honestly don't need to do a lot of that. Just doing anything to kind of like pad the surfaces around you can help. You can go full on and like buy acoustic foam and build yourself a tiny little microphone box and put your microphone inside that.
Grab a fashion cube.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we've done that actually.
Yeah, by fashion cube we mean these. I had a lot of like home decor places where there are those fabric cubes that fold up, and you can unfold them, and it's like a little storage cube. If you've got one of those, you fill it up with acoustic foam, like you pad all the walls of it, I guess you'd say. And like T was saying, put your mic in there. You've got like a little portable studio, basically, which is pretty handy, but can get pretty sweaty if you're recording for a long time.
I was going to say, if you know what's paying for acoustic foam, eat a lot of eggs, and then use the cartons. They work. Maybe not just as well, but they work.
Yeah.
There are lots of like DIY solutions you can do to try to make like a small recording booth without spending a lot of money. Because if you're getting started, the whole problem is how can I keep doing this rather than how can this be the best podcast? Because becoming the best, like no one ever was, is like a second step. Be consistent when you're recording. We talked about mic distance, but also just like always record in the same space with the same tools. It just makes everything easier because you don't have to, as you were mentioning with the editing, when you have different guests and different setups every time, you have to spend a lot of time tweaking your setup. Especially if it's just the same people in the same space, it's really easy. You can get your podcast editing into a smooth flow of editing. Pop screen, have one. They're super, they're affordable, and if you don't want to pay for a pop screen, it's a thing that sits. That's not a great example. It's a screen that sits in front of the microphone, and kind of anytime you make a popping sound, like a P or anything like that, you're welcome.
Yeah, like if you're stopping podcasting, well, a pencil, you could do that, but that's going to be really tiring. It's a similar effect though. Pop screen breaks up the sound, so it just is smooth.
Favorite part of having pop screen is it tells you how far away to be from the mic.
Yes.
You can just put it right there, and then you can have your mouth right up against the pop screen, and it's going to sound fine.
If you buy a pop screen, they're usually adjustable, and like G's saying you can just set it wherever you need it to be. You can also make one out of like nylons and a coat hanger.
Yeah.
But honestly, like how much is a pop screen? Like $10?
Yeah.
$15? They're not super expensive, and they usually have a clamp, so you can just like mount it to your microphone. It's very easy.
I've heard some people use a sock.
Yeah.
You
Just like-
you can do that.
Yeah, putting the sock over the microphone. Yeah.
That works.
Yeah. During recording, get some room tone. What is room tone? It's the sound that your room sounds like when you're not speaking. That one makes it easy to remove any strange noises, but also if you are recording and there's a pause, you can insert that room tone later. If you don't, you end up with this weird situation where it sounds like people are talking and then there's dead silence. And you're recording in some sort of bizarre space that exists outside of time and space.
Yeah.
Okay.
Carry on.
And just avoid noise. If you know that you live in an area that's noisy, at 6 o'clock every day there's a train that comes by or something like that. Just try to avoid that situation. If you know that you have roommates and they come into the house at a certain time, like record at a different time or record in a different space. Just try to avoid situations where there's lots of noise, because random noise is really hard to remove in editing.
If it's a hot day and you need the window open and it's noisy outside, and you need the window open, too bad. Just close the window and remember why you're doing this.
Suffer for your art.
Exactly.
In regards to room tone, in certain podcasts that I've worked on, instead of having like room tone, they basically have a backing track and putting it on low volume. Would that be a good substitute, or like have you experimented with that before?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Like having the backing track playing while you're recording, or adding it.
So like
Okay.
we'll have the podcast going on,
Yep.
but while that's happening, our mixer is basically playing a really small thing, so that way we can talk over it, but it doesn't drown everything else.
That's a good way especially if you have like a fan running or something that's hard to edit. If you're doing a live stream in particular, where you can't really go back and edit it after the fact because people are watching it live, that's a good way to hide any of the kind of problems that you might have. But also depends on what kind of podcast you're doing, because you might be doing a podcast where you don't really want any music playing in the background. If you're doing like a review show, like it could be great to play some of the music, like the soundtrack for whatever you're reviewing in the background. It can add to the podcast.
Demonetized.
We're not talking about that. Editing. Man, there's a lot that goes into editing, but I'm just going to toss it over to our editor because he's the editor.
Thank you. Yeah, as he said, that there is a lot that goes into editing. First off, if you're working with just one track, if you're doing a solo podcast or you just have one microphone and everybody's crowding around it, that takes out one step. You don't have to synchronize anything, which is nice. But if you're recording from multiple microphones, multiple locations, whatever the case may be, if you wind up with more than one track, you'll have to synchronize that. And that can be fairly easy. I know a lot of podcasts do like a clap at the beginning, and then they use that. For whatever reason, that's never really worked for us. There's like a lag issue or something. Anyway, what we do is we've got this program called Call Note, and what it does is it records the Skype call. So what you wind up with at the end of the call is this audio that is everybody on the call at basically the same sort of quality that you're hearing through Skype. So it's pretty decent quality, not the greatest, definitely not the worst. And what we do is we use that to sort of act as like the scaffolding or the skeleton that we synchronize everything to. Yeah.
If someone, say, forgets to record their track or something like that, it comes in really handy. Not that that's ever come up.
Yeah. Even having a clap there is useful because then you can kind of see, like a clap is a very distinctive waveform, so it's like, this is where we actually started recording the podcast.
Yeah.
And the reason that we bring up the syncing and everything like that, when you're recording a podcast, it can take, I think 4 times is on the low end. It's like 4 to 5 times.
I think 3 is
Okay.
probably on the lowest end.
It's 3 to 4 times the recording time in terms of editing time.
Yeah.
So if you decide to record like 6 hours of a podcast because it was so great, you're gonna love it when you are editing it and have to just cut out reams and reams and reams of audio because the editing just takes that much longer. If you're doing a video podcast, it's even longer. It's probably around 8 times because you not only have to deal with any audio flubs, but you also have to deal with video. Maybe you have a pet. Maybe it walks into the shot and you didn't really want that to happen. Maybe something in your scene falls over. Yes.
Do you try and have a set time for how long you want your podcast to be?
In our particular case, at about the hour, we record for about an hour, and at about that point, we're like, okay, we should start thinking about wrapping things up. But it depends, because if you're doing a discussion-based podcast and it is really good, then you just need to be mindful of it. I don't think we could honestly do like 6 hours of recording in a row.
Oh.
No.
Like batch record, you mean?
Oh, we might
for
like
sure.
not batch record, but yeah.
Not a 6-hour episode.
Yeah, no, I don't think anyone wants to listen to a 6-hour episode.
Release. So this is the easy part. Actually, this is where the work really starts. There's like a Sisyphean effort that goes on when you're doing a podcast where every step seems like you're almost done, and then you keep pushing that boulder up the hill, and the boulder keeps moving up the hill, but you're never at the top. One of the biggest things about releasing your podcast is let people know that you did it. You might think, cool, I posted it on Facebook, I posted it on Twitter, I posted it on, I don't know, Pinterest, I Snapchatted it to all my friends somehow, it's on Instagram. That's cool, but you can't just put it out in the world and expect that you're done.
I literally thought that was true when we started. I'm like, we made it. It's us talking for 15 minutes. I posted on Facebook, and I'm like, all right, wait for the listens to come in. That did not happen. I'm like, I already tweeted it once. What else am I supposed to do? Like, the answer's tweet it again, and again, and again, and again. The average lifespan of a tweet is 20 minutes.
Oh, it's that short?
Yeah.
Okay.
Longer than I expected.
Yeah, I know, right? And it's like yelling into the void. Don't expect to get anything back. If you do, great. It's great to find people on Twitter and talk to people, especially if they're interested in your podcast. But just kind of figure out what hashtags you might want to use or be identified with, and then just kind of keep yelling into the void. And maybe someone will stumble upon it.
Yeah. In addition to yelling into the void, you can also network with people, and sometimes people are like, well, I don't really know how to network. I don't know what that really entails. Just make friends with people. A way that has worked really well for us is we interview guests on the show, and oftentimes that means like we get to meet this person and we get to learn about them, and then we start following them on Twitter and like, oh, this person actually does a lot of cool stuff. Sometimes it's the other way around,
Yeah.
and we found really cool people that we wanted to talk with, and then we get the chance to talk with. And sometimes that works out in really cool ways. There's this one podcast, the Epic Film Guys, and for whatever reason, this other guy who is also named Nick, this was not planned, really likes the things that we do. So we run this charity event, which we'll talk about at the end, and he's been promoting it, sadly, more than we have.
He's tireless.
Yeah,
I think it's because he's dedicated to his own race against the race.
yeah, we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
But, getting those people on board with you to help you out, because everybody wants everybody to succeed. Like, you all want your podcast to succeed, otherwise why maybe you don't. I don't know why you're doing a podcast if that's the case. But you get invested in other people and they get invested in your work. Yes?
In regards to promoting your content, so Nick G brought up earlier how you have to consistently put stuff out there, but how do you make it so that way you're in sort of the Goldilocks threshold between not putting out enough and then consistently spamming? Like, what is the good barometer to basically have it so that way you're promoting but it doesn't overstay its welcome?
I've heard on social media it's like a third your content, a third other people's content, and I forget what the last third is. It's not your stuff. It's I don't remember. But that way you're not putting too much emphasis on your own work, and you're also kind of boosting other people's voices, and it doesn't feel super spammy. Sometimes you can also just posting things at the right time of day. There's numerous guides out there that are like, hey, these networks are most active these times. If you're using Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, they tell you when people are consuming your content, so you can kind of look at that. But in terms of just avoiding being spammy,
I would suggest, personally, what I do is I am extraordinarily self-conscious. So I feel horrible if I feel like I don't feel like I've ever been spamming someone's timeline, because I don't want to do it. I don't want to, impose all my stuff on other people. But at certain points I feel embarrassed for even just like having our tweet mainly advertising us instead of just being like cool opinions and riffs on other things. But
oh, cool. 1/3 of your social content promotes your business. Okay, yep, that's what you're talking about. 1/3 should be surface and share ideas. 1/3 should be based on personal. Oh, I see. Yeah, so it's like a third not promoting your stuff, but like being genuine, a third promoting your stuff, and a third promoting other people's stuff.
yeah, I move maybe 3 or 4 tweets a day of our own stuff. I mean, using tweets maybe once a day on Instagram. That's what I do. I don't know if that's the recipe for success, but I don't feel like that's intruding on anybody too much. And if there are people who want to follow you and enthusiastic about your content, then they're not going to mind.
Well, and I think that's an important point too. Whenever you're doing the podcast, whenever you're promoting the podcast, like in most endeavors, you should always try to be genuine. And I don't mean because that's hard. I mean, unless you're really trying to be a character, and I don't think most people are, they're being themselves. So don't do things that you wouldn't do that aren't like you. Like, you would not just spam everybody on Twitter because that's not who you are. But you would be like, hey, this is an important thing that I'm doing and I'd like people to know about it. And as such, when you promote the event, or when you're promoting whatever it is, you're doing it in a way that's genuine to you. And that's kind of how you have to be in your interactions. That does mean that you'll have to do some things that are uncomfortable. Like the 3 of us are all introverts as far as I know.
More or less.
More or less, yeah.
Yeah.
And that makes things a little bit more challenging, but that doesn't mean we can just put out a tweet and then leave it out there in the void. That means if you're an introvert as a podcaster, then you kind of have to push yourself a little bit and be like, okay, I know that I'm not super comfortable with this, but I'm going to promote this more. I'm going to go talk to this random stranger that I met at a convention and say, hey, have you heard about this thing? Or more likely, it's like, oh, I noticed you have this really cool shirt about Power Rangers or about crap. I was thinking Andromeda, but it's not Andromeda. It's no, it's not. It's the one with Commander Shepard.
Mass Effect.
Mass Effect. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Brain fart.
Way off, man. Come on.
There was a Mass Effect Andromeda.
We don't talk about it.
Okay, never mind.
Get out.
Get out. Okay, that's okay. We're wrapping this.
I do have a good news, bad news situation. I'm focusing on Twitter, but I can talk about Facebook. Don't bother. Instagram. Just like a bunch of people's stuff. But there's a good news, bad news situation with Twitter. If you put please RT, people will RT it. But retweets don't necessarily equal people paying attention to you or listening to your podcast.
Oh yeah, that's something to keep in mind too. You're putting in all this effort to your podcast, you're releasing it, you're promoting it. It's very likely that sometimes you won't, the cause and effect will not line up. Sometimes things will get really popular and you don't know why, and most of the time nothing will happen, and you put a lot of effort into it and it's unclear why the effort that you put in doesn't end up being results. That is something that you just kind of have to live with and accept that you just need to keep trying and making your podcast better and just trying and not getting frustrated and giving up, because a lot of it is just a factor of like luck and time when somebody sees things or decides to follow or any of that stuff. We've been doing this for 4 years. We started one podcast, wrapped it up, started a new one, and then in the course of a week we went from like a few people had heard of us, and then suddenly we were on Spotify, and then we did a panel last night and people knew who we are.
Yeah, it was strange. But like, I'm sure this is the first time you've ever heard this advice before, but just make sure that you enjoy doing it regardless of whether people like it or not. I mean, I know we're like sometimes it gets like we keep not hearing anything about anyone talking about it, so I'm like, okay. But again, but we still all have a good time recording the podcast every week. And if that wasn't true, then we wouldn't be doing it.
So
Yeah, thanks. Just very two quick things. There is no one single recipe for success. And as far as social media goes, it's really tempting to think that it's all about like talking to as many people as possible, which can make it like rather intimidating for somebody who might be a little more introverted. But like, I think there's sort of two ways you can do it. You can do that like shotgun approach where you just tweet out a bunch of stuff and hope that the most people see it, or you use it as more of a one-on-one kind of tool. And I think Twitter is maybe really good for that. Instagram, Facebook, I don't know so much, but with Twitter, it's pretty easy to like meet with people sort of one-on-one. It's just an approach to consider.
So you have a Jedi approach versus a Nephlite approach. Jedi try to get energy from as many people as possible. Nephlite's like, I can get more energy from one person than he could from a whole crowd.
I got that reference.
Do you feel validated now? Somebody got it?
I'm very happy.
Yeah, so as far as our recipe for podcasting success goes, or in this case, starting a podcast and actually getting it done, that's it. Obviously, at this point, your podcast is hugely successul. You are running panels. You are making millions of dollars on YouTube. No, I'm kidding.
That's how the fairy tale ending goes.
That's how the fairy tale ending goes. But the reality is that you take that boulder, you push it up the hill, and every day you make it a little bit further, and presumably one day there is actually an end to the hill. This is not a Sisyphean effort. And you do see things succeeding in some regard. Maybe not the way you dream in your head, but you start to see progress. But it takes time.
So that's a picture of us and links to our information.
Finally, we know what you look like.
I've been listening this entire time. I didn't open my eyes.
We should have been wearing masks or something to simulate. Yeah, curtain to simulate the podcast experience.
Yeah.
And audio only.
Well, it's funny because like we missed the start of the panel, so until just now, I'd heard the comments that you all had the same name, but I didn't know what the name was.
Perfect. Amazing.
What did you have any guesses?
No.
It's GTZ.
Like it could be Chris. It could be
I mean, there's lots of Chris's.
I'm one.
Just find a couple of the people with the same name, and then you're good.
Yeah, so that's pretty much it. If you have questions, like throw them out here. We'll do our best to answer them. Question?
Yeah. Would you upload to multiple websites at the same time?
When you say multiple websites, do you mean like Twitter or like YouTube and our website and like other places?
Yeah.
Sometimes, like that is definitely. Nick Z talked about like a personal versus shotgun approach, and in terms of promotion, oftentimes like the different platforms that we've talked about or talked about in brief will provide means of putting your content in different places. When we launch an episode, it's usually like, okay, we'll tweet about it. You can find it it'll be on Twitter, and there's usually an embedded widget. But it's also like this is a link to Spotify, so you can go to Spotify, and then sometimes you can also post onto YouTube, and they'll post like a video format of your audio podcast.
Yeah, like it's not a bad idea to put stuff up on YouTube because there are people who only experience their audio in their life via YouTube, which I'm not one of those people, but I understand a lot of people do it. So it's good to just be available over there. And also, like, you definitely, we didn't talk about it for a reason. You definitely don't need like a website or anything to be a successful podcast because like people don't go to websites anymore. We're on Web 2.0, right?
Yeah. But like that is one approach that you can take to try to get more reach for your podcast. But something that we didn't touch on is with regard to social media, that you should use the platforms that you actually use. Don't be on a dozen networks because you think it's a good idea, especially if you can only really manage one or two. Pick one or two and be really good at that.
Yeah, it goes hand in hand with enjoying the thing that you're recording, enjoying the podcast that you're making. You should be on the social media that you enjoy being on, because if you're just on it and it's kind of a chore to like stay on it and keep tweeting or keep Facebook posting or Instagramming or whatever, like, weirdly somehow that'll come across and people will not engage with your content quite as much.
Does that answer your question? Okay. Other questions? How many people here want to start a podcast? Okay. But no questions from
Well, our presentation is thorough and informative. Dude.
Very good job.
Oh, good.
What do you use for a hosting service for the .coms?
Oh, cool. We use Podbean, but we've tried to use Podbean previously and SoundCloud. SoundCloud was not a good experience. It's not really designed for podcasters.
They give you an actual .com?
Oh, no, they do not. Podbean will give you like something .podbean.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you can get a custom domain. Most of the services work that way. They'll let you like set up your own host name, and then they'll give you a really simple website. Podbean just hosts your episodes. It doesn't like if you had multiple kinds of content, like a blog, or you wanted to do reviews that were just text only. There's no way to do that on something like Podbean. But like Podbean, Libsyn, and many other platforms, you can have your own website with custom pages and like a whole blog format and all that.
Actually, Podbean does let you make text posts because we use Podbean and because we put descriptions of our episodes and like what you have to watch and stuff like that. I was gonna ask like why do you moved from Podbean because that's what we're using.
Oh, our specific problem was half the time we'd go to visit the webpage and it would say the name of our podcast and some of the information, and then literally everything below the fold where all the episodes would appear would just not render some of the time.
That's weird. I've never seen that.
I've contacted support and they were just like,
could it be?
It's because you changed the theme, and I was like, okay, that's a weird.
Yeah, Podbean's working kind of sucks.
Yeah. So we didn't like.
I have noticed one particular issue with Podbean. We accidentally uploaded a file with the same file name as another episode and lost the old episode. And it was an older episode that we didn't have a local copy of. And there was no like, are you sure you want to?
Actually, that leads to a question. For recording, is it better to like pre-record your stuff and like save it somewhere and then release it, or just record and release it at the same time?
In most cases, unless you're recording in the same space in like a studio and you've got all of your dynamics processing and everything happening in real time, you almost always have to do the first thing, which is like record it and then edit it and then release it. I've listened to like one podcast where at the end of the episode they're like, we record this and then release it pretty much immediately after, because they're in a studio where it's dynamically, that's fine in this case, where they can dynamically like just they don't have to do very much editing because they've perfected their speaking and their editing is very, very light.
We have about 2 weeks between recording and release. Just like time for editing and stuff, but also our podcast is not very. It doesn't matter that it comes out now or 2 weeks from now. It's not about anything current. It's evergreen, as they say. Well, you can listen to it anytime, and it makes just as much sense. Whereas if you're doing like a news-ish kind of thing or doing reviews of something that's ongoing, you're going to want the turnaround time to be quicker, just because it's about something that's current and happening now.
Yeah, and if that's the case, then you're probably going to set up your recording and editing process so that you can accomplish that. In which case, you might be in the same room recording and you just acknowledge that you're not going to cut out any ums and ers and rs. This is a raw recording, we're just going to like treat the audio so that it doesn't have all this like fan noise or something like that, and then we're going to drop the opening and the ending on the end of it, and then we're gonna, that's it. So like the kind of podcast you do dictates how you're going to do that work.
And that's why I can't recommend Streamlabs OBS strongly enough, because you can have like different scenes and sound effects and live dynamic processing and all kinds of noise effects as you're recording built right into it.
Yeah. Oh, we didn't. I briefly mentioned there are several different tools you can use for audio editing. Audacity, which is free. Adobe Audition, which is not, but like is a lot more powerful. There's Logic Pro if that's your kind of thing, if you're more musician oriented. And there are many other tools.
We use Avid Studio.
Sorry?
We use Avid Studio.
Oh, okay. It's been a while since I've heard that. Yeah. Other questions? Yes?
How do you decide how much time to delegate to different subtopics within the same episode?
That's a good question.
Well, I can feel that in part at least. As far as subtopics go, when we started out, the original podcast was just like a straight, here's our topic, let's talk for about an hour about it. And that kind of worked, but we felt we needed more structure. So when it comes to stuff like subtopics, in our case, it's a little bit more like sections. So, and the sections are generally the same length. Like we have sort of an introduction where, since we're talking about a different fandom every week, we kind of give some basic background information about the fandom, like when it started, how big is it, that sort of thing, where is it popular, and then we move on to more of a broader discussion of why people get into it, and that's usually the bulk of the episode. Like the introduction is maybe 5 minutes, the why is maybe 45, 50-ish minutes, and then the spotlight, where we talk about a cool fan thing and do our plugs, is maybe 5-10 minutes depending, and then as we wrap things up with the famous last words, that might take an extra 5. So but those aren't hard numbers by any means. Those are pretty flexible, and because the sections are kind of soft borders in and of themselves, it's kind of a flexible format.
I would say like talk while you have things to say.
Yeah.
And be mindful of time, because you're going to have to, somebody has to edit it after the fact. And there's often a point that I've noticed when we were talking where, somebody withdraws, and like having good chemistry with your co-host, if you're doing that, or if you're doing it solo, it's probably the hardest. Actually, it might be these. When you're doing things solo, you kind of run out of steam on your own. You're like, okay, I don't really want to talk about this anymore. This is a good point to stop talking about the subtopic. With friends, it's like, how much are you on the topic? When do you start deviating from it? When do people start seeming disinterested in it?
This is slightly getting into, I think, perhaps podcast 1 and 2. But as you mentioned, we have different segments in our podcast, and that helps us a lot to keep the energy going. Because before it was just like, yeah, we're talking about this for an hour, and we just talk about it until we run out of steam. But we have like these little segments, which I think is like more interesting as a listener, because you're like, okay, this is this section, and you can like your way through the podcast. But like as well for us, we're like, okay, we're at a fresh segment. I can start with new material again, and it's just a way of keeping everybody going without just like, well, we're burned out on this episode, let's just end it.
Yeah. This is kind of a complete tangent, but I realized that I forgot it now, and
Sure.
We are the kings of forgetting to do this part. When you're promoting your content, don't forget to plug it. So we mentioned we do a podcast, and it's up here, but we're also doing this really cool thing called the Race Against Time, which is a charity video gaming marathon where we play through Chrono Trigger, the best game of all time. If you disagree, fight me, but not actually, because I'm very fragile. And we're raising money for the Alzheimer's Society of Canada, because in Chrono Trigger, you're kind of changing a future that might not really impact you. Chrono, Marl, and Luca are characters who eventually face Lavos, which is a big evil thing, and they'll never really have to deal with that in their lives, but somebody will. And like that, we want to kind of do that for Alzheimer's. We want to stop Alzheimer's. So if you want to check that out, we have some stickers up here for the Race Against Time. You can find it at raceagainsttime.io or twitch.tv/raceagainsttime. They go to the same spot. And we would be glad to talk more about that. But I didn't want to forget to plug it, because that is the thing that you should definitely do. Because you think it's like, oh, people won't really like the thing that I'm doing. But if you don't talk about your work, then nobody else will.
Yeah. And I just want to clarify, stealing G's usual words, we are the Knicks cast, the three of us, but the show that we're promoting is Anthropological. Yeah, just because it's anthropological.com is there, but maybe that's just a fun website name we have.
Yeah.
The podcast is Anthropological.
We like 6-syllable names. It's great. Yeah, so we'd be glad to answer any questions, but I think we're pretty much out of time.
That's it.
Yeah. So thank you everybody for joining us.
Yep.
And if you have any questions, just come up here and talk with us.
Yeah,
we also
have some stickers, have some cards.
yeah.
Sure.
Oh yeah. First person up here can have a free Race Against Time shirt. Unfortunately, we only have a medium and an extra large because I'm bad at planning.